The Galactic Empire had ruled over 1,000 worlds with an iron fist for centuries. It saw itself as the peak of civilization, bringing order to the chaotic fringes of the galaxy. But for humans, it was nothing more than a gilded cage. They were tolerated, used when necessary, and discarded when inconvenient. The Empire did not fear them. It should have. Elias Kane had once believed he could live quietly under their rule. A former strategist for the Terran Defense Corps, he had seen enough war to know that fighting the Empire was suicide. So when Earth fell, he laid down his weapons, buried his past, and tried to build a life. That life was her, Celine. She was fierce in her own way, not with weapons, but with words, with her unshakable belief that humanity deserved more. He had always admired that about her, even when he thought she was naive. She worked as a researcher, cataloging how imperial policies were slowly suffocating human colonies. It was dangerous work, but she swore she was careful. Careful wasn't enough. They came for her at dawn. Elias woke to the sound of boots against metal, the heavy thud of a battering ram. Before he could reach for the weapon he no longer kept by his bedside, armed soldiers poured in, dragging him from his bed. Celine fought. She always fought. But there were too many of them. A single accusation, sedition, treason, conspiracy was all it took. The truth didn't matter. The Empire did not need trials when they had executioners. They didn't even take her away. They shot her right there in their home. A warning to others. A statement that human lives were worth less than the energy it took to process their deaths. They left him alive. Maybe they thought he was broken, that his spirit had been crushed. Maybe they thought a grieving husband would never be a threat. They didn't know who he used to be. For days, Elias sat in the ruins of his home, staring at the bloodstains that would never wash away. He barely ate. He barely moved. But grief didn't consume him. It sharpened him. The Empire had taken the one thing that had made him want peace. Now all that was left was war. He moved with purpose, cold and deliberate. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He had buried Elias Kane years ago. He was something else now. He gathered what he needed: credits, weapons, contacts. The old channels weren't hard to find. War never truly ended. It just went quiet, waiting for someone to speak its name. The first to die was an officer, Commander Jorith, the man who had ordered Celine's death. Elias didn't kill him quickly. He made sure the man understood, made sure his last moments were filled with the kind of fear he had never imagined a human could instill. When they found his body, the message was clear. This wasn't an act of random rebellion. This was personal. The Empire barely acknowledged it at first. Officers died all the time in backwater colonies. But then another one fell. Then another. Each time, Elias struck with precision, taking out supply depots, disrupting communications, stealing classified data. He was methodical, ruthless. The whispers began to spread. A ghost was moving through the Empire's ranks, cutting out its heart one piece at a time. They started asking questions. Who was doing this? Why? But by the time they realized the answer, it was too late. The man they had left alive had become the one thing they feared. The Empire believed itself untouchable. It had crushed rebellions before, wiped out entire species for less than what Elias had done. But they were used to fighting armies, not ghosts. He wasn't building a resistance. He wasn't rallying for a cause. He was hunting. He needed resources. Weapons were easy, every world had a black market, and credits could buy silence. But intelligence was more valuable. He needed names, schedules, security protocols. That required people. Not an army, just the right ones. He found them in the forgotten places. The disgraced officers, the smugglers who had lost too much, the technicians who had seen what the Empire truly was. They weren't heroes. They weren't idealists. They were survivors, and that made them dangerous. He fed them a vision, not of victory, but of revenge. They didn't need to win. They just needed to make the Empire bleed. Their first real strike was a refinery on Athen Prime. It wasn't just about destruction, it was about precision. The Empire relied on predictable supply chains, on systems that ran without interference. Elias turned that against them. They hit the facility from the inside, taking out key personnel before detonating the core. It was over before the local garrison could react. Then came the shipyards. A virus in the docking protocols, a cascade failure that left a dozen Imperial cruisers dead in space. By the time repairs were possible, Elias and his people were already gone. Each attack was a lesson. The Empire learned, adapted. They increased security. They tightened their grip. That only made them easier to strangle. Elias anticipated their moves before they made them, striking where they were weakest, turning their own paranoia against them. They sent assassins. He sent their heads back in crates. They set traps. He walked right through them, leaving nothing but bodies behind. He wasn't just fighting the Empire. He was breaking it. And still, they didn't know his name. The attacks weren't random anymore. They were calculated, coordinated, each one striking deeper than the last. The Empire was beginning to realize this wasn't just another insurgency. It was a campaign. A war fought by a man they couldn't see, couldn't predict. And now they were afraid. Fear made them reckless. They turned their weapons on their own people, tightening security to the point of suffocation. Mass arrests, public executions, entire districts locked down under curfews. It only fueled the fire. Every act of cruelty created more cracks in their foundation. Elias exploited them all. He didn't just destroy resources, he stole them. Weapons meant for Imperial forces disappeared. Supply convoys rerouted to nowhere. Encrypted data leaked to the highest bidder. The Empire's own systems became unreliable. Their once flawless logistics tangled in a war they couldn't control. They needed a face for their enemy. They needed someone to blame. And finally, they found him. Elias Kane. The name spread through military channels like wildfire. His past, his record, the reason he disappeared after Earth fell, it all came flooding back. The Empire had made a mistake. They hadn't killed a nobody. They had killed the wife of a man who had once designed wars. They declared him the most wanted human in the galaxy. Raised the bounty so high that even his allies started to wonder if turning him in was worth more than revenge. It didn't matter. He wasn't hiding anymore. The next attack was bold. A full-scale assault on an Imperial War Council, the kind of target no rebel force should have dared to touch. But he didn't need an army. He needed precision. In one night, 5 high-ranking officers vanished. Some were dead. Some were worse than dead. The message was clear. He wasn't just coming for their soldiers. He was coming for their leaders. The war was no longer in the shadows. It was out in the open. And the Empire was losing control. The Empire was collapsing under its own weight. Supply lines were in disarray. Officers no longer trusted their own men. Entire battalions refused to deploy, fearing that any order could lead them into a trap. The fear Elias had planted was no longer a weapon. It was a disease, spreading through every rank, every system, every world under Imperial control. But fear alone wouldn't end this. The heart of the Empire still beat. The ruling council, the architects of everything that had taken Selene from him, still sat behind their fortified walls, believing themselves untouchable. That was his final target. The capital world was a fortress, its defenses layered over centuries. No force could break it, no fleet could take it. But Elias had never waged a conventional war. He didn't need an army. He needed access. He had spent months preparing for this moment, planting the seeds of his final strike. Corrupt officials, overlooked maintenance crews, Imperial officers who had lost everything. The right people in the right places waiting for the right signal. When it came, the walls didn't fall. They crumbled from the inside. Security systems failed. Power grids overloaded. Automated defenses turned on their own ships. By the time the Empire realized what was happening, it was already too late. Elias walked through their halls like a ghost, past the bodies of those who had built their empire on the blood of others. He didn't waste time with speeches. There was no negotiation, no mercy. The last thing the ruling council saw was the man they had made, the consequence they had never considered. And then it was over. The Empire didn't die in fire or battle. It died in silence, in the absence of the leaders who had held it together through fear. Without them, the structure collapsed, power struggles tearing apart what remained. Elias didn't stay to watch. He had never fought for power, never wanted to rule. His war was finished. The galaxy would remember his name, not as a hero, not as a villain, as the man who made the Empire bleed. The Empire was dead, but its shadow remained. Without leadership, warlords rose from the wreckage, each claiming a piece of what was left. Some sought power, others wanted revenge. Chaos spread across the galaxy, consuming everything in its path. Elias had no interest in what came next. He had done what he set out to do. The people who had taken Selene from him were gone, their legacy shattered. But vengeance didn't bring peace. It didn't bring her back. It only left a void, one he had no intention of filling. His name had become legend, whispered in the darkest corners of space. Some called him a savior, others a monster. None of it mattered. He wasn't a symbol. He wasn't a leader. He was just a man who had lost everything, and now he had nothing left to fight for. The offers came. Leaders of the fractured remnants, resistance groups, even old enemies wanting him to take the throne he had left vacant. He ignored them all. He had spent years tearing down an empire. He wouldn't build another, so he vanished. Some believed he was dead, cut down in the chaos he had created. Others swore they saw him, slipping through the edges of known space, a ghost with no purpose. But the truth was simpler. He had fought his war, and now he was finally free. There was no freedom in a broken galaxy. The Empire had fallen, but in its place chaos ruled. Factions tore at each other like starving beasts, each trying to carve out their own dominion from the corpse of what once was. Former imperial generals turned warlords. Criminal syndicates seized entire planets. Rebellions that had once fought for liberation now fought for control. The cycle continued. The names changed, but the bloodshed remained the same. Elias watched from the fringes. He had no stake in what came next. He had done what he swore to do. His war was over. But war had a way of finding him no matter how far he ran. The first time they came for him, it was a band of mercenaries, desperate to claim the bounty still lingering over his head. He didn't run. He didn't need to. They were untrained, undisciplined, men who thought legend could be killed with brute force. They learned their mistake too late. The second time, it was a former imperial officer, one of the few who had survived his purge. He came not with a threat, but with an offer. Help restore order. Lead what remained of the fleet. Take what was rightfully his. Elias barely let him finish speaking before putting a bullet between his eyes. He had never fought for a throne. But the third time, it wasn't mercenaries or desperate remnants. It was survivors. Families left stranded in the wake of his war. Colonists abandoned by the systems that once ruled them. Humans who had spent decades under the Empire's boot, only to be left adrift in the lawlessness that followed. They didn't beg. They didn't demand. They only asked one thing. What now? Elias had no answer. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't a savior. He was a man who had burned down the galaxy's greatest power out of grief and rage. But looking into their faces, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Something that went beyond revenge. Hope. He told himself he would walk away, that their problems weren't his to solve, that he had done enough. But the truth was, he had never been fighting just for Selene. He had been fighting for something bigger, something he hadn't wanted to admit. A future where humans didn't have to kneel. So he didn't run. He didn't hide. He did what he had always done. He planned. He prepared. And when the next war came, he was ready. This time, it wasn't for vengeance. It was for something worth saving. The war that came next was different. It wasn't fought in the shadows, not built on revenge. It was raw, brutal, and inevitable. The Empire's fall had left a vacuum, and nature abhorred a vacuum. Power-hungry warlords, broken remnants of the old regime, and opportunists with armies of their own all scrambled to take what they could. The galaxy was a battlefield, but this time, Elias wasn't hunting ghosts. He was fighting for something real. At first, he resisted the call. He had never wanted to rule, never cared for power. He was a soldier, a strategist, a weapon honed by war. But as the fire spread, as innocent worlds were swallowed in the chaos, he saw what was coming. If no one stopped it, humanity would be erased, not by an empire, but by the lawlessness left in its wake. So he chose a side. He gathered those who had once fought alongside him, the remnants of his old network, the survivors of his war against the empire. He didn't need an army. He needed precision, control, and a cause worth dying for. Humans had spent too long as pawns in the games of greater powers. This time, they would be the ones shaping the board. The first battle was not fought with ships or weapons but with information. Elias had spent years tearing down the Empire's infrastructure, and in its ruins, he found his advantage. He knew where the warlords were weak, where their fleets were stretched too thin, where their allegiances were built on nothing but greed. He didn't attack them head-on. He made them turn on each other. He fed false intelligence, whispered betrayals into the right ears, sabotaged supply lines, and struck where they least expected. Fleets burned before they ever reached the battlefield. Alliances crumbled under the weight of paranoia. He made sure they tore each other apart before he ever fired a shot. But war was never that simple. One warlord saw through the deception. A former imperial admiral who had risen from the wreckage with a fleet of loyalists and a mind just as sharp as Elias's. He didn't fall for the traps. He didn't take the bait. He studied Elias the way Elias had studied the Empire. And when he struck, it was devastating. Half of Elias's forces were wiped out in a single engagement. His network was compromised. His allies were scattered. For the first time since this new war had begun, he was the one being hunted. But he had learned long ago that wars weren't won by strength alone. They were won by endurance. He adapted. He changed the game. If his enemy wanted a battle, he would give them one, but on his terms. He lured the admiral's forces into a system filled with dead planets and silent traps, where gravity wells disrupted their navigation, where pre-planted explosives turned the battlefield into a minefield. He used the chaos against them, and in the end, the admiral's fleet was shattered, not by brute force, but by precision. With their greatest tactician gone, the warlords fell one by one. Some surrendered, some fled into the unknown. But one thing became clear: Elias wasn't just fighting to bring order. He was winning, and for the first time the galaxy began to wonder, was he creating something new, or was he building an empire of his own?